Roger Waters with Is This the Life We Really Want? It's been a while since we've talked about Roger as a whole, outside of the Pink Floyd Horizons. He had a sort of classical / opera style album that he released about, I want to say like a decade or so ago that was not very well received. Of course, he continues to tour with The Wall and some of the other properties of Pink Floyd. But his last proper studio album has been about 2 decades in the making. It's been a long time. So it's nice to see Roger Waters back with this disc. Of course, one of the big questions that a lot of folks are going to no doubt have is whether or not he's able to really recapture some of the emotive sides of his personality, which were seen not only during the latter stages of Pink Floyd, but also during his solo career with albums such as Amused to Death or The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. So is this the life we really want? Is this the album that we really want from Roger Waters? And, well, I think for a lot of people, it is going to be exactly what they want, principally because it does all of those things that we just mentioned. It has a lot of that emotion that is captured within the mind and the soul of Roger Waters, and it is presented in a way that is very familiar to a lot of listeners. And what I mean by that is that he's able to sort of offset all of the calmer moments that this album has with some of the similar tones that will be very familiar to listeners from the tail end of that Pink Floyd saga with The Wall, or either the Final Cut, and also will seem very familiar based around some of his Elder Scrolls, such as The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking. He has always had a tremendous voice whenever it comes to really getting his message across, whether it is one that's going to have some sort of veneer to it, or if it's powdered just based off of a simple storyline motif. And you get that very easily with The Last Refugee and Deja Vu, which have a little bit of a softer exterior to them at first, but then the harmonies and the tones of his guitar really are able to surge inward and deliver a lot of that's where a lot of the emotion kind of comes from, because his voice, Roger's voice, has never been one that has had a very dynamic, large range to it. Yes, he's able to go from a lower cadence all the way up to a whine or a yell, but it is something where it sticks within a pristine range, and that delivers kind of its own sort of haunting and surreal feeling behind it. And it's something that is once again true throughout this album. It's something where it can either provide a feeling of hope or hopelessness, or whenever you get into a song such as The Most Beautiful Girls Smell the Roses and Wait for Her, which almost feels like a sort of triptych toward a beloved, or perhaps something that has a little bit more of a metaphoric meaning behind it. It gets one that really, that softness works almost like a very commanding and loving older gentleman who is really trying to show the affection towards somebody that has been by his side perhaps for a long time, or even just a sort of wayward crush or a wayward feel. It's interesting to hear how Roger is able to incorporate all of this together, and yet still also use some of that sort of pseudo-psychedelic funk or classic rock veneer in order to deliver these tones. Now those are all the positives. Here's some of the negatives, at least from my vantage point as a long-time Waters and Floyd fan, and it's the fact that this is a trick that doesn't exactly seem all that new. And to be fair, that's exactly what you should expect. It's not like Roger Waters is a bright-eyed and bushy-tailed 27-year-old in this scene anymore. No, he's instead lived his whole life in the era of music, so it's going to be difficult to teach an old dog how to do some new tricks. He's not David Bowie, after all. But this is an album that feels like it really relies on some of those trademark treasure tropes and does not 100% aim to fixate on the strength of his songwriting. Instead, it just really arcs to, aims to arc the familiar a little bit instead of necessarily treading all of that new ground. Kind of the similar complaint that you might get from, say, a David Gilmour release, although I do say that the most recent Gilmour release was just a bit more enjoyable because I think it was just overall presented a little bit better. The flow of this album is very well done, and that's something that Roger's always been kind of the master of. He's always been a terrific storyteller, whereas David was more of just the traditional songwriter. So this is a album that feels very complete from first to 12th track as far as storyline is concerned. But the concern is that the songwriting is just not 100% strong. It does have all of the sort of cadence of a voice that has returned to maybe make one last statement, but it's one that overall feels more average rather than exceptional. And I think a lot of times whenever you listen to an album from somebody that you've not heard from in a while, you're immediately going to have a little bit of that hangover sickness of this being something that's brand new, that's going to sort of jade your judgment a little bit. And then whenever you go back, you start to recognize, well, maybe this was just a little bit of an oversight of my brain thinking that this was so exceptional. And the great example that I could probably give is actually The Next Day, to go back to David Bowie. This is an album that had some strengths to it, but I think that since it had been such a long time since we had heard from David Bowie at that point and at that juncture, it was a little bit more well-received based around the idea of, man, it was nice to see him back. And then, of course, we heard what we were able to get from Black Star, which just blew us away. Is that necessarily going to happen with Roger Waters? I hope not, because basically Roger Waters needs to stay right where he's at. I like what this album attempts to do. I just think that it's not one that is really above average. This is pretty much par for the course for what you'd expect from Roger Waters. It's pretty well presented. The flow is great. The songwriting is, okay, and his voice, of course, still registers all of the emotional, all of the emotion that is needed in order for this to sort of work. But it feels just like a 15 out of 30, a very average album. One that's going to be nice to sort of dust off for a listen every now and again, but it's not going to be one that's going to continuously occupy your radio space unless you are a just absolutely magnificently huge Roger Waters fan. Either that, or you found something about this album that was truly captivating. And if you did, then I would like to know about it. Please let me know your thoughts about Is This the Life We Really Want by Roger Waters in the comments below. I'm CoverkillerNation, and I will speak to you guys next time. Take care.